What it really takes is a family, and we as conservatives have to fight for the family.
A party that desires to lead this country must have an agenda that the American people believe helps them.
What is it that we can do to keep government from growing so large we can win this battle?
Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing one of America's greatest living statesmen, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer. I mean that sincerely. Many in Washington claim to be principled. Few actually are. Even fewer stick to their principles throughout the course of their life, and fewer still understand how to translate their principles into action. All qualities that Ambassador Lighthizer has perfected over a lifetime of public service. He was right on the question of China when no one else was even paying attention, arguing in a New York Times op-ed in 1997 against their entry into the World Trade Organization, saying, quote, "China wants to join the WTO to achieve a dominant position in world trade. Indeed, its industrial strategy is based on its right to become an export powerhouse. Viewed in that light, it is not an exaggeration to say that if China is allowed to join the WTO on lenient terms that it has long been demanding, virtually no manufacturing job in this country will be safe." He was right from the beginning, and over 3.7 million jobs in manufacturing were lost after China joined the WTO. He was the principal architect of the paradigm shift on China during the Trump administration, and his policies will redefine the way that both Republican and Democratic administrations approach the nation of China for a generation to come. NAFTA was Holy Writ in Washington, D.C., and 3 days after being sworn into office, he informed Congress that he would be renegotiating the trade deal and successfully improved upon it, leveling the playing field for American workers, farmers, and companies, and being the first USTR to renegotiate a major free trade deal. Throughout the course of his life, he was a defender of national sovereignty against international bureaucracy. He worked to expand U.S. exports, stop unfair trading practices, and protect American industry. He earned the nickname of Missile Man during negotiations with Japan under Reagan for folding up a proposal like a paper airplane and throwing it back at them. He embodies the virtues we seek to instill at this conference, namely applying the wisdom of the American economic tradition to the challenges of the present. And tonight we have the privilege of hearing him discuss the new American system, trade for workers in the 21st century. Ambassador Robert Lighthizer served as the 18th U.S. trade representative during the Donald J. Trump administration. Alongside President Trump, Lighthizer engineered a historic trade agreement with China that put American workers first. An experienced trade negotiator and litigator, Lighthizer has dedicated his life working for equitable trade enforcement for the U.S. and has an impressive record of fighting for American farmers, manufacturers, and companies. Prior to joining the Trump administration, he was a law partner at Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom, where he practiced international trade law for 30 years. Before joining Skadden, he served as deputy USTR for President Ronald Reagan. Lighthizer earned a bachelor's degree at Georgetown University and a JD from Georgetown Law Center. He has 2 children, and in his free time, he enjoys playing golf. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Robert Lighthizer.
Well, that was quite an introduction. When I was sitting there, I was trying to decide whether or not my mother would have believed it. I hope that none of you do. It is, in fact, true, and a piece of advice that I would give that's free is that you sort of make up your mind to what you're going to do, and then you stay in your own lane, and you do those things, and you stay on track. And likely, if you get old enough, people will look back and say you were wise. So, Senator Sessions, it's a pleasure to be here with you and the other distinguished guests. The loss of our institutions to extreme liberalism is one of the great crises of our day. The work of the Intercollegiate Student Institute to counter this decline is noteworthy and admirable. For almost 70 years, the ISI has been on the front lines in defense of freedom and American values. And I am honored to be here today to speak to you. I'm proud to be part of this battle and to work with you to retake our country. I'm of the age that grew up with William F. Buckley. I read his works, I watched his TV debates, I quoted his witticisms. He was wise and entertaining, which is no easy feat. I can remember the debates with Gore Vidal. Has there ever been a more perfect foil for a conservative champion? If any of you have not done it, I recommend you go on YouTube and do it. Those performances between two clever, brilliant men were fun and informative. Like so much in life, they were really about confirmation bias. And as a young conservative, I always came away more sure of my principles. We all have our favorite Bill Buckley quips. Perhaps my single favorite was during his 1965 campaign for mayor of New York City. He was running against a very liberal Republican named John Lindsay and a very liberal, bland Democrat named Abraham Bean. The campaign was quixotic. Buckley never really had a chance. He was running to promote conservative values, and probably he was running to promote William F. Buckley. When asked the difference between his two opponents, Buckley noted that Lindsay was very tall and that Bean was very short. He said the differences are more biological than ideological. But that was not the quip of the campaign. That came when Buckley was asked what he would do if he won. And he famously said, "I demand a recount." That became the line from the whole campaign and really one of the famous Bill Buckley lines. Now, Buckley received about 13% of the vote, a significant number that tipped the victory to the Republican Lindsay. Buckley's strongest support was among white voters without a college degree who were traditional unionized blue-collar workers. These were people who were tired of liberal snobbery and the negative effects of liberal governance. This may have been the first sign of the Reagan Democrats that brought about his revolution and that eventually elected Donald Trump president. Everyone in this room knows that this great crusade that we are engaged in, and I guess I'm not allowed to say crusade, but I'll have to come back another time and talk about woke terminology. This great crusade may have begun with God and man at Yale. I'm sure that all of us from time to time wonder what Buckley would think about the current state of Yale or higher education in general. As bad as secularism, censorship, and liberalism were in his time, that looks today like the golden age of academic freedom. I can remember my time at Georgetown in the late 60s. We thought that all of our institutions were under siege, and I guess they were. But that seems placid compared to today. Part of the reason may be that those radicals that I debated in those days are your professors today. But then looking out at this crowd, I have hope for the future. Thank you for picking up this important battle for conservative values. But I didn't come here today to talk to you about that. I'm a trade guy, and I came to talk to you about trade and international economics, about failed policy and patriotic economic revival. For while the forces of the left were consolidating the supremacy of extreme liberalism in American universities, the economics departments of those same schools were just as universally committed to promoting the doctrine of free trade. As with so much in academia, there was no real debate. All the clever people agreed that free trade was the only sensible course. Except they were wrong, and millions of working men and women paid the price. I want to challenge the way many of you think about trade. I believe that we as conservatives should not be slavish champions of the free trade theology, and that this creed has for decades failed our nation. We need to change the focus of our policy away from price optimization, consumption, corporate profits, and globalism, and move it towards workers, their families, our communities, production, and values. We need to make every policy choice in this area, determining first what effect it will have on our people as producers and members of families and communities. We need a worker-focused trade policy, not a corporate, price-centered one. We need to take every step necessary to eliminate the trade deficits that are bleeding our country to death and achieve balanced trade. That is precisely what President Trump and I did for 4 years, and the results were astonishing. Donald Trump ran for president in 2016 for several reasons, but perhaps most importantly, because he felt unbalanced, unfair international trade deals were hurting our workers and destroying their communities and the American way of life. One could almost see his movement as a natural reaction to the failed policies of the previous 25 years. The 1990s brought us the dial-up internet, searching the web, sitcoms like Friends and Seinfeld's, and one William Jefferson Clinton. Emboldened by the exuberance that flowed from America winning the Cold War, Clinton and his team thought they were infallible and all-knowing. The tide of history had turned. Among the conceits they embraced was uber free trade. They doubled down on this failed policy. They pushed the controversial North American Free Trade Agreement through the House and the Senate. They helped create the World Trade Organization. And in his final months in office, he made the ultimate concession to China. Clinton persuaded Congress to grant them permanent most favored nation tariffs and allowed them into the WTO. This was the trifecta of bad policy, 3 historic mistakes. And our workers, their families, and communities all suffered. In the years that followed, we lost millions of good jobs and saw tens of thousands of factories close. We witnessed the stagnation of wages. We saw economic division in our country grow at an alarming rate. The rich got richer and many fell out of the middle class. We ran up trillions of dollars in trade deficits, essentially shipping our wealth overseas and making our children poorer. Incredibly, much of this wealth transfer went to the People's Republic of China, at best a strategic adversary. This economic upheaval contributed greatly to the breakdown of society. It destroyed many of our communities, crushed our families, and contributed to opioid addiction and the explosion of so-called deaths of despair. Now, I'm not saying that extremist free trade was the only cause of these crises, but I am saying it was a major factor. We all remember the wisdom of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. If the English exchange their cloth for Portuguese wine, both are better off. There's the famous comparative advantage. I'm sure they were correct for their times, but in those days, capital seldom crossed national borders. No mercantilist nations of the size and scope of China existed, and it was viewed as an impossibility for a country to run decades of huge, continuous trade deficits. To be clear, I'm not against trade. In fact, I think trade is good and that more trade is better. But it has to be fair, beneficial to our workers, and above all else, it has to be balanced. In the 25 years before Donald Trump, we let trade get wildly unfair and dangerously out of balance. We forgot that the purpose of economic policy is people, not things. I chose as the title of this talk, The New American System, Trade for Workers in the 21st Century. Donald Trump ran for president to change decades of disastrous trade policy. He felt deeply for those who had been left behind by free trade, and he won in large part because those people supported him. For 4 years, he did not let them down. He challenged the orthodoxy of free trade and used tariffs, threats, negotiation, and industrial policy to help our workers. But we were not the first to do this. In fact, the essence of our policy has a very proud tradition in our country. In March of 1824, Henry Clay, then a congressman from Kentucky, made a speech which famously referred to the American system. Clay, whose distinguished career made him part of the great triumvirate along with Webster and Calhoun, argued for a system of tariffs, a national bank, and subsidies for infrastructure to develop a young nation's manufacturing base and its economy. His ideas were rooted in the writings of Alexander Hamilton, who used the term in 11 of the Federalist Papers. Andrew Jackson and a rural Democratic Party managed to thwart much of Clay's agenda during his lifetime. But by the time of Abraham Lincoln, who greatly admired Clay, and for 60 years afterwards, the American system transformed our country. The combination of tariffs and infrastructure subsidies was crucial to our becoming the largest economy in the world by 1890. It helped create the great middle class of workers and farmers and led to the establishment of thriving communities across our country. Indeed, tariffs remained relatively high until well after the Second World War, and much of our historic economic development resulted from government subsidies. Public works projects and subsidies that transformed our country include the Erie Canal, our system of railroads, which were economic only because the government granted large tracts of land to the companies, the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, the Kennedy Space Program, Reagan's military buildup, and the list goes on. All facilitated commerce and, importantly, contributed essential new technology to our economy. President Trump and I were the inheritors of this tradition. The American system was, in some ways, an ancestor of America First, and we need it more today than ever. We should use tariffs strategically to stop unfair trade on our market and to ensure the elimination of trade deficits. We need more spending on traditional infrastructure, but also on the great competition for high technology. China and Europe are spending hundreds of billions of dollars to compete in such fields as artificial intelligence, robotics, and advanced materials. We must do the same. Further, we need to invest government money in the semiconductor fabrication. We can't continue to be 2 generations behind in logic chips and to rely on imports for 87% of our needs. Many of you may be thinking you're conservatives, and conservatives are for free trade. Actually, there is nothing conservative about free trade. What exactly are these people conserving? Free trade is a philosophy of consumption, and the elevation of consumption is the essence of materialism. Materialism fosters the neglection of values. It is the exact opposite of conservatism. Near the center of conservative thought is preserving what is best in our institutions and traditions. It is about the very values materialists would have us ignore. Free traders seek price optimization. They view us only as consumers and want to maximize consumption, and that means lots of imports. I believe that Americans are first producers, not consumers, and that no country ever became great by consuming. They all became great by producing. Many economists believe that we should have a free trade policy that produces the lowest price goods, and then we should enact programs like welfare or unemployment payments to deal with the negative effects this has on our citizens and our country. We believe that is exactly upside down. Our primary objective should be policies that will build strong American families and communities and create productive, high-paying jobs. That should be our goal, not cheap stuff. In a policy choice between corporate profits and American jobs, we should always protect our workers. We should never forget that there is an inherent value in work and the pride that comes from supporting your family. This pride builds communities, and it should not be sacrificed for TV sets or T-shirts. This is the essence of conservatism, and making America great is the core of patriotism. We are conserving values, the American family and strong communities. That's what Ronald Reagan wanted. That's what Donald Trump fought for. Indeed, Alexander Hamilton, arguably the father of American conservative, was no free trader. His whole life he supported tariffs and industrial policy to promote American manufacturing. In fact, throughout our early history, conservatives and Republicans were not free traders. There were 12 Republican presidents before Eisenhower, and everyone promoted using tariffs to build American industry. They all supported the American system, explicitly or implicitly. Theodore Roosevelt famously said, "Thank God I am not a free trader. In this country, pernicious indulgence in the doctrine of free trade seems inevitably to produce fatty degeneration of the moral fiber." I subscribe to that view, in case you were wondering. The Gilded Age was a period of Republican ascendancy, relatively high tariffs, and monstrous economic growth. After World War II, President Eisenhower was far less concerned with building American industry. Our economy was the only significant one in the world, and he correctly wanted to see Europe and Asia rebuilt, the establishment of democratic governments, and the defeat of communism. President Nixon was for market economics, but then when there was a growing trade deficit and a run on our gold, he put tariffs on all of our imports and kept them there until our trading partners agreed to raise the dollar value of gold. Ronald Reagan spoke of free trade, but he insisted on limits on the number of Japanese cars coming into the United States. He protected our semiconductor industry. He required limits on steel imports, defended Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and trust me, I was there. I could go on. In fact, one libertarian group said that he was the most protectionist president since Herbert Hoover. No Republican president was really a free trader, with the possible exception of the Bushes, and even 43 put tariffs on steel to save our industry. Finally, let me ask you this. Many of you have taken economics classes in college. Probably all of your professors preach free trade. How many of them were conservatives? My guess is not many. And if you say you had a lot, then like Johnny, you probably went to Hillsdale College. Another myth is that trade makes the world more peaceful and democratic. You've all heard it. This view was the common wisdom of the cognoscenti of the 1990s. President Clinton and his free trade crowd used this myth to sell their China policy. With access to our market, China would become a larger version of Switzerland. That's what they argued, benign and democratic. Thomas Friedman wrote a book selling the proposition that countries that trade don't make war. Not even Friedman believes that anymore. The principal problem with this proposition is that there is no support for it in history. World trade was an astonishing 21% of GDP in 1913. And that didn't stop the Great War from beginning. The US and Japan had substantial trade before Pearl Harbor. The North and the South had enormous trade before the American Civil War. And of course, Ukraine and Russia had much trade and economic connections. And that didn't stop Putin from rolling his tanks in. Let's consider another myth. We were taught that trade deficits don't matter. We have heard this from economists and newspaper editorial boards forever. It is true that if you run a trade deficit one year and a surplus the next, they may net out. Likewise, running a surplus with one country and a deficit with another likely won't matter. But that is not what has happened to America. We have been running deficits of hundreds of billions of dollars year in and year out for decades. These trillions of dollars come back in the form of foreigners owning American assets permanently. There is a statistic called the net international investment position, how much Americans own abroad, equity, debt, and property, versus how much foreigners own of America. The United States net international investment is an astonishing negative $16 trillion. Foreigners own $16 trillion more here than we own around the whole world. And there is a negative compounding. Foreigners, including China, own these assets and the future income of these assets. We literally are trading the wealth of our country, the ownership of our equity, debt, and property for Christmas tree lights and toys, for tennis shoes and garden tools. We are bleeding to death from self-inflicted wounds. So, do massive consecutive trade deficits matter? Only if you care who owns and controls your country. There's another myth. We're told that America is post-industrial. We don't need manufacturing. You've all heard it. We're going to have a services economy. This, too, is balderdash. We have the biggest economy in the world. We need to make and grow things. It is true that manufacturing jobs make up only about 11% of our employment. But these jobs, in turn, spin off millions of other jobs in the services sector, for example. Think accounting, advertising, transportation. Further, disproportionately, innovation and productivity and exports are in manufacturing and not services. 65% of research and development is in manufacturing. 92% of our exports are in this sector. And 42% of productivity growth is in the manufacturing sector compared to only 24% for services. And generally, manufacturing jobs pay better. The median manufacturing job pays $22.50 an hour. The equivalent number for retail is $14.30. For hospitality, it's $13.70. And for administrative services, $17.50. Also, manufacturing workers, on average, receive far better benefits and stay in their jobs longer. But most importantly, 60% of American workers have only a high school education. Their best chance to get into the middle class is through manufacturing. If we want strong communities and an innovative economy, we need more manufacturing jobs and the related jobs that that sector creates. If you doubt me, just ask Japan, Germany, France, Korea, and yes, China. President Trump was committed to changing the conventional trade policy, and he succeeded wildly. We protected U.S. jobs and pressured businesses to bring their plants back to America. We rewrote NAFTA to create incentives to build cars and other products here. For the first time in any trade agreement, we included a sunset clause. The deal would automatically end if it was not extended. This allowed for future negotiations if it again got out of balance. We incorporated enforceable labor and environmental rules to assure fair competition. We made deals with Korea, Japan, and many other countries to rebalance trade and to gain new market access. To combat Chinese and other unfair trade, we massively raised tariffs and used laws not enforced for decades to help our workers and farmers. The America First trade policy, combined with tax cuts and regulatory reform, was a fabulous success. Millions of jobs were created, factories came back, hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs returned. Remember President Obama saying those jobs weren't coming back? You'd need a magic wand to get them to do that. Well, in Trump's first 26 months, manufacturing job growth was 4 times Obama's last 26 months. Turns out, sensible trade and economic policy was a magic wand. Our global trade deficit in goods improved year over year in 4 of 5 quarters leading up to COVID. And far more importantly, median family income rose 6.8%, the highest in history. More Americans were working in higher paying jobs. Families and communities were recovering. Trump's second great contribution to trade, economic policy, and really foreign policy was to raise the alarm on China. It is difficult to think back 6 years and recall the common perception about China. Most considered it to be a benign partner in economic development, a collaborator in technology innovation, and a hoped-for market for American products. In short, a friendly force. That perception was dangerously wrong, and President Trump changed it. To start, he asked the one fundamental question: is China a friend or is it a foe? Is China a friend or is it a foe? Every policy choice flows from the answer. Now, 6 years later, anyone who doesn't understand that China is an existential threat to America and to our values and way of life is either a fool or a knave, either ignorant or groomed and bought. Clearly, China is an adversary. Let me review. China has the biggest army in the world and is expanding at an alarming rate. It has the biggest navy in the world and is building ships far faster than we are. It is militarizing the South China Sea at a rate not seen since the Second World War. It is aggressively asserting claims to land on its borders and building an enormous naval base on the disputed Spratly Islands. It is positioning itself to threaten international shipping lanes. It is building scores of new nuclear silos all across the country. It is engaged in a $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative designed to expand its influence around the world and to give it access to intelligence and military bases in Africa and ultimately South America. Its diplomatic corps, its so-called wolf warriors, are virulently anti-American. It is responsible for most of the fentanyl that comes into this country and kills our communities. It engages in relentless spying on our country. The FBI opens a Chinese espionage case every 12 hours. It is enslaving millions of Uyghurs, and it is spending vast amounts of money to influence our universities, business leaders, and politicians. On the economic side, China has engaged in aggression against the United States for years. It has a mercantilist policy designed to build its economy at the expense of others, including us. Using a largely closed market and massive subsidies, it has stolen our technology, manipulated its currency, infiltrated our infrastructure, hacked our business and personal databases, engaged in cyber attacks on our private and governmental systems, undertaken espionage against our businesses and our government. China accounts for 80% of all counterfeits coming into America, and the theft of IP by China alone is estimated to cost this country $300 billion a year. In short, it has conducted economic warfare on us and the West of the West, and it has done so for decades. As a result of this and our own foolish trade policies, we have lost millions of jobs and much of our technology leadership and have transferred trillions of dollars to them. These huge annual trade deficits have built their military and developed their industry and their technology. Their economy has grown from about $1.2 trillion in 2000, when ours was about $10 trillion, to about $16 trillion, to about $10 trillion now, when ours is 16. In this period, our cumulative trade deficits in goods with them has amounted to more than $6 trillion. The United States has not faced a foe with economic power this close to its own in 130 years. And there are predictions that their economy will surpass ours very soon. In no sane world does a country transfer this much treasure to an adversary. The Trump administration faced this challenge head on. The core of our policy was an obscure trade statute called Section 301. In short, it allowed the president, through the USTR, to levy tariffs on the products of foreign countries that engage in practices that are unjustified, unreasonable, and discriminatory, and that also harm the U.S. economy. We conducted the necessary investigation for 8 months. We issued an extensive report and began to raise tariffs in the summer of 2018. After a year of escalation and negotiations, we reached a so-called Phase 1 agreement that, importantly, kept the tariffs in place. It also provided for some systemic changes on their part and guaranteed large new purchases of U.S. products. COVID, of course, intervened and affected the purchases, but the agreement was largely successful because it kept the tariffs in place. There were 3 purposes for these tariffs. First, they offset some of the unfair economic advantage that Chinese producers have in our market. Second, they helped reduce the trade deficit. And importantly, most importantly, they began the process of strategic decoupling of our economies. While I am not yet in favor of total decoupling, I do believe that we need to strategically disentangle. Our trade and economic integration must be balanced and on terms that help America and its workers. We should not link our technology sectors, for example, and we clearly should have no trade or industrial cooperation at all in the security or joint use technology sectors. We need to limit Chinese investments in the U.S. economy and to regulate outward bound investment to China. We should put tariffs on all their products imported from there until we achieve balanced trade, and we must insist that they buy our products if they want any access at all to our market. Now, Chinese officials will say that we are trying to hold them back to stunt their development, but that is not true. What China does economically in its own country is its business, but how those policies affect ours is our business. Importantly, they are the aggressor and we are the aggrieved party. We are engaged in a great competition with China for the future of the world that will determine whether free democracies or totalitarian communism is a system of the future. But we are also engaged in a competition within our own country between those who would sell out our future for short-term gains, those who believe consumption is more important than production, that imports are more important than jobs, and that stuff is more important than people. As conservatives, we must work to preserve the values that made America great. Families, communities, and the dignity of work are among those values. We need a new American system, one that will help rebuild our country and protect our workers and their communities, as well as preserving our values. I welcome you to this fight. You are the generation that has the most at stake and which has the greatest chance of seeing us have this success. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's as I read through the speech, I thought, I hope nobody has indigestion. This would be like going to a speech about World War II in the middle of World War, right? So I apologize for the sobriety of my remarks. But anyway, so we have some questions.
Over here to your right.
I can't see where you are. I can't see anything, to be honest with you.
Okay.
The whole room is just a blank.
To your right.
Oh, I see. All right.
Yes, thank you again, Ambassador Lighthizer. We have another question from the app, and the question is, How do we combat rampant consumerism in the United States?
What was the adjective? What kind of consumerism?
Rampant.
Oh, rampant. Yeah, well, the easiest way to deal with consumerism is to raise prices, particularly prices on imports. Yeah, that's one of the things the free traders say. Well, people won't consume as much. And I'd always say, is consumption a problem in America? Right? I don't know. That's a really fundamental kind of question. It goes to what kind of a community we have, what kind of values we have, what kind of families we have, right? I mean, this issue of consumption versus production is a fundamental question, and it really is the way we have to frame this debate, that the elevation of consumption is not and should not be a high priority. Economics really developed as a way to allocate scarce resources, right? That's the whole notion of it, right? And then they study that, and the reality is we're sort of post scarce resources in the United States. So I would tell them to pray. That would be my advice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech, Ambassador. It was very delightful. My question deals with more of the political process of tariffs and sort of limiting free trade. And it's on the notion that inevitably, if we don't have free trade, and it's not run by captains of industry, quote unquote, it's run by where we put the tariffs. Inevitably, the question comes up: who decides what gets tariffed and what doesn't? You put a flat tariff on everything? Do you tariff some things more than others? What exactly, how do you design that? And whatever system you come up with, how can you avoid the inevitable problem, which is that congressional leadership ultimately will decide what gets tariffed, what gets regulated, and it won't be, the people, unless you're able to completely reinvent the leadership structure of Congress. Under the current Congress, I'm telling you, San Francisco, Bakersfield, California, New York State, and Kentucky are going to be the beneficiaries of this new tariff system. So how do we decide which communities benefit from tariffs?
So it seems to me that, like, rather than an economic question, it's a political question, and you just don't believe in the congressional system in America. Is that like a quick summary?
No comment.
I mean, are we going to get perfect legislation out of Congress? No, but that's a democratic process. You get the right people in Congress, you have a majority, they'll do a pretty good job, and to the extent they don't do it, and I was up there a long time on the Hill as a staffer, to the extent they don't, they'll come back and correct it. No system is going to be perfect.
I'm not asking for
But you're
perfection.
offering as an alternative free trade, which doesn't exist. So almost anything is better than something that doesn't exist. All right. But to focus specifically, there's a long history in the Congress, which history stopped maybe, more than 100 years ago, of having Congress actually set specific tariff rates. And if you look at the old trade, the old tariff bills that we can go through, and we all know the names of them, or maybe most of you don't, but some of you do, there would be a log rolling, and it would be very much like what happens in a tax bill, right, where there's Christmas trees, and people do that, and people try to work out. And they get more or less to what is a fair thing. But I'm not necessarily proposing different tariffs on different things. My view is we ought to have across-the-board tariffs, for sure. Now, there may be a category of tariffs, of things that you don't tariff, right? Something that's essential to health or whatever. And there may be another category of things that are you have to make in America, right? But for the most part, I think you have a simple system across the board, and you put tariffs in place. It's not that complicated. We have a system. We've been collecting tariffs since the beginning of the country. Everything's gone along fine. And you have a fair system, maybe 3 categories of tariffs. You have the additional advantage of being able to pay down the deficit a little bit, something that's not insignificant. And you end up reducing the trade deficit, getting it back to balance, and helping American workers and farmers. It's not that complicated. See, the problem, it's like I say, when people talk about China policy, I say, let's just go back to basics. And I said it twice. Are they friend or are they foe? In this case, Your supposition is that there's nothing wrong with trade deficits, right? And I think they're fundamentally wrong. I think they absolutely are the worst possible thing. They're terrible. So you have to do something. You can't, every one of us knows in your own life, you can't go on forever consuming vast amounts more than you produce. What happens? Ask your mom. Ask your youngest child. Most people don't have children, but ask your youngest sibling. Everybody knows that, and that's where we are. You see, your problem is you don't think that's a problem. And if you don't think trade deficits are a problem, then hell, let's just go on, consume. I want you, by the way, to fight with this lady over here about the consumption side of it, too. We could just go on and on and on. The fact is we have to do something about the trade deficits. We're going broke.
Thank you for speaking. I actually agree with most of what you said. I kind of had a question on moving towards the increase in tariffs because, I know we all kind of laugh at consumers and the consumption culture we have, but consumers aren't just, blind faces. It's not just a name. It is actually Americans, and Americans do benefit from lower prices, even though most certainly some Americans hurt from those lower prices, like people in manufacturing. And so right now, obviously, we're seeing high inflation. We're seeing a lot of Americans who don't make as much money suffer from higher prices, and tariffs are a de facto tax on your citizens because you're arbitrarily increasing the price on products to favor other products. So how would you suggest we move towards what I agree with you, which is increasing domestic manufacturing, but also protecting people from drastic increases in prices over time?
So first of all, it may be unfair, but my interpretation of the entire question is, I agree with everything you said, Lighthizer, except I don't really believe anything you said. So once I kind of cross over that, you have sort of two issues. One is, do you continue to import from China? All right, so I hope we can all agree you put tariffs on China and at least you want balanced trade, if not no trade, but at least you want balanced trade. You got to put tariffs across there. Then the next thing is, are American citizens hurt more by trade deficits and loss of jobs than they are by having things cost more? And that's just a simple question. In me, it's quite clear. But if you wanted to say, could you phase it in? I think for sure you would phase it in. And you would try to do it in a way where you didn't necessarily pick winners and losers. Although, as I say, I'm prepared. I always hear this, don't pick winners and losers. I'm thinking, well, hell, everybody picks winners. Every time I watch a football game, I pick winners and losers. But economically, I'm prepared to say there are certain sectors that I bet every one of us would get around here and say, you got to have that. You got to have missiles. You got to have some things. But to me, you have a simple across-the-board tariffs. You could phase it in over a couple of years. And if I had my way, kind of the way I talked about it in The Economist last year, I would have it set up so that tariffs would go down over some period of time if you got to balance. But you have to buy the idea that trade deficits are bad. Both they cost us jobs, and they cost us wealth, and we're going broke. So will it cost people money? Yeah, it'll cost people money. Is it an inflationary policy? No, it's not an inflationary policy. You'd have a one-time hit. That's just like our tariffs did. We had a one-time hit. What I'm proposing is broader than what we did with China. But when we put tariffs on $370 billion worth of products from China, inflation didn't go up. Inflation actually went down slightly, not because of that for sure, but just because it wasn't a big enough factor. But I think you phase them in, you're going to have a one-time hit, so the prices will go up somewhat. You'll have probably less consumption, particularly at the margin, but you're going to end up with a fiscally sound country with stronger communities, better off workers, happier families, less all the other things that come from economic upheaval.
Ambassador
But there have to
Lighthizer.
be more libertarians in this crowd than that.
Ambassador Lighthizer, first, I just wanted to thank you for your service in the Trump administration. I think you were one of the most effective people there, and I hope when President Trump gets reelected, you come back to that job, or if Peter Navarro is to be believed as the Secretary of Commerce. My question is kind of a two-parter, I guess. One, autarky, good thing or bad thing? And autarky, good thing or bad thing? And making everything in the United States, having no trade with the rest of the world. And two, if not, what in your mind, if you were able to wave a magic wand, would the composition of the countries that America trades with primarily look like? Presumably there'd be a lot less China, but where would we get most of our traded goods from? Would it be South America, Europe, Africa, Asia? What does that world look like?
Well, my first preference is that they're made in America, right, by American workers. That's my first preference, and I think that's what we have to do. And in the context of absolute balance, I don't care where the products come from as long as they don't come from China, right? And if I had to have a pecking order, and I said this before, I think that among low-wage countries, the United States has a stake in Mexico's prosperity, which we don't have in a lot of other countries' prosperity. So for me personally, I think we're better off importing more from Mexico and not from China and some other places. But I say that just because selfishly, we have a border with Mexico, and the better off, the saner, the more stable Mexico is, the better the United States is. And we have lots of Mexican Americans. There's a lot of reason to do business down there. But with the exception of China, which I view as an existential threat, I guess my view would be it's probably not up to me, right, to determine where the products come from. They would flow naturally if you had tariffs across the board to certain places. We have a free trade agreement with 20 countries. Presumably those countries would have an advantage. They're supposed to have an advantage. If you read more of my stuff, you realize I'm against free trade agreements too, though, by the way. But I'll discuss that at another time if people really care. But to me, you put tariffs across the board and let the market determine where it comes from.
Thank you.
Hello. All right. So first off, I'd like to say I very much appreciate not only your speech, but what ISI has done for us, specifically because it has given me new things to think about and challenged my views in some ways. So I really appreciated the brief history of political thought you gave. You mentioned Clay, you mentioned Hamilton, Calhoun, etc. Now, typically speaking, Hamilton is grouped in with the globalists, and some groups, rightly or wrongly, see Hamilton as the progenitor of the urbanization, the industrialization, and ultimately world trade and free trade. So I really appreciate that you pointed out his protectionist policies. So that said, I wanted to ask you to speak specifically to what some see as Thomas Jefferson's critique of that, namely that if we bring manufacturing over home and to the domestic realm, what we're going to see is the inability of people to become self-sufficient farmers and have individual autonomy. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I'm sorry. I followed you about people trying to pretend like Hamilton was a globalist. When Hamilton talked about the American system, the alternative to the American system in their terminology was called the British system. And that was a system where you preach free trade and then basically try to have colonial preferences so that everyone buys from you and sells you input products. But so I'd address that, but I didn't get what was there about something about, I'm sorry, I just can't hear very well in here.
So succinctly, the question would be, if we bring manufacturing over to the United States as opposed from importing goods from abroad, one might have the concern that people who would normally use the space for urban centers and factories would normally use that for farms and small town initiatives. However, if they're replaced by large industrial centers, they will not have that self-sufficiency. Do you see this as a valid critique or not?
No, I don't see it as a problem at all. We've got lots of space. We had lots of factories and lots of farms in the past. I mean, I think they can coexist. I don't, and in many cases, factories are getting smaller, not larger, right? I mean, so no, it doesn't bother me. I should repeat, too, what I said in the speech quite specifically is I'm not against trade, right? I just want it to be fair and balanced. And if you put tariffs on and you have fair and balanced trade, the markets, you're going to have a fair amount of trade, and the market's going to end up basically sorting out where things come in from. So I don't want to create the impression that I'm against trade, all trade. I'm not against it at all. I think the United States really needs to export. I think we have to be able to compete around the world. I just don't think you can do that and run, last year in goods, $1 trillion trade deficit. And you certainly can't do it where you're transferring last year $350 billion to China, right? Those things just don't make any sense. So I don't want to create the impression that I'm against trade. I think trade's a good thing. There are a lot of people, it benefits a lot of people, a lot of workers who make money selling overseas. It's just that when you net it out, it's got to be balanced, and it's not right now. I mean, it's wildly not, and it hasn't been for decades. If you look at the history of it, it really did remarkably change in the 1990s. And if you look at through maybe the beginning of, you know, the Reagan period was kind of the first time when you saw sort of a regular recurrence of trade deficits and a fear growing up because of them. And as I say, what Reagan did is the problem then was Japan. It really wasn't the rest of the world. And in that case, he took steps to stop their advantage. You know, did Americans pay more for cars? Probably. So maybe instead of getting a new car every 3 years, they got one every 3 years and 3 months, right? But we ended up with an auto industry, which we wouldn't have at all if he hadn't done that, right? And then ultimately what we did by keeping their products out was have the Japanese decide to come and build their cars here because they saw this as a problem, a long-term problem. And now we have, you know, a fantastic automobile industry in the whole, well, in Senator Sessions' state, it's for bloody sure, but that whole band across the country are all Japanese companies, some Korean, and some German, that are here because the alternative they thought was they might get shut out of the market and they can avoid tariffs. And so they manufacture here. And it's been a very, very successful policy for us.
Well, thank you for that answer. That's very insightful. Thank you.
We have another question from our app. Someone asked, can you provide your perspective on the CHIPS Act, and what would be your response to Kevin Roberts' perspective that he shared earlier, that the spending is too large and it doesn't sufficiently restrain companies from diverting that money into foreign economies?
So I didn't hear his remarks, but I will say what my position is, and I've said it on television and I said it at a conference on Tuesday. We can't lose this battle. If we lose the high technology battle, a lot of the other stuff we're talking about is not going to matter, right? You have an F-35, which is probably the most important thing to American security, with the exception of our nuclear deterrent, and 92% of the chips don't come from America. I mean, you can't have that. You have to have chips. So and that's the one thing. You can't lose, you have to have them. Doesn't matter. And we're way behind. Intel's the only thing we have in the logic chip area, and they're at least 2 generations behind. People argue about how much. So you can't lose the thing. Now you look over, is there a market solution? That would be perfect. All right, then you say that Korea, Europe, Japan, and China have already announced about $1 trillion worth of subsidies. So you think you're going to sit there with them spending $1 trillion, you can't lose, and you're not going to spend any money? Right? To me, it's madness. Then the question becomes, is this the most efficient way to do it? And the real question should be, is this the most efficient way to do something urgent right now? And on Larry Kudlow's show, I made the point, which I think is apt. He and I worked, and I was Senator Robert Dole's staff director when we did the Reagan economic package. Basically, Dole wrote the Reagan economic package. You recall the Democrats had the House and we had the Senate, and we basically wrote the package. Was that bill perfect? By no means. But as Senator Dole would say, when someone would make this argument, this good, enemy of the best argument, he'd always say, we're not going away. We're going to be here next year. We can fix things. So to me, you want to make sure China doesn't get the technology. Personally, I think you want to make sure that the United States taxpayer gets some of the benefit if this is successful. You get some payback. That's what I would do. And you want to do as little wasteful stuff as you can. But, and my sense is that's probably where we are right now. And my guess is if it passes, and I think it probably will, that come January, the Republicans will have some important ways to improve it. And then when that happens, I'm going to hope that passes too. So I think it's too critical not to do something. I think we're at the time where we have to do it. And like we do with every important piece of legislation, we're going to have to stay around, keep Congress working on trying to make it better as we get down the road.
Good evening. So my question's in regards to what, if anything, we should do for workers who are going to be hurt by scaling back free trade. For example, people who work in factories that might go out of business due to higher costs of steel, or say soy farmers who, because we export 12 billion worth of soy to China a year, if we stop trading with them or trade less with them, people like that might go bankrupt. So what, if anything, should the government do to help victims of its more protectionist trade policy?
I'm sorry, I just couldn't hear it clearly enough. You're saying what should we do for workers who are hurt by the current trade policy?
No, for if we adopt a more protectionist policy, even if on net it's a good thing, there are probably going to be workers who lose their jobs because of it. So should the government have a special program to help them, or is it just you win some, you lose some?
Well, I mean, which workers again? That's what I'm not. We have trade adjustment assistance.
Well, no, I mean, if you're, say, during the previous administration, workers would say lose their jobs if a factory had to lay off people because of the higher costs of steel due to the trade wars. So for workers like that, is there a policy?
All right. Now I see where you're going. What are we going to do with all the people because we're manufacturing at home who are going to lose their jobs because we're not importing parts from China to make our cars? My guess is we won't have to worry. If we have the policy that I'm talking about and we get to balanced trade, there won't be any workers who are losing their jobs. When you have $1 trillion trade deficit, you can have a lot more manufacturing in the United States when you get to balance. But are there programs? There are programs for people who lose their jobs because of trade. But that's not something that I'm here to talk about or particularly espouse. I had a labor union. It's called trade adjustment assistance, and I had a labor union. One guy, one of the presidents of one of the unions, tell me once, we don't want a spot at the front of the welfare line. We want a job. That's what they want. They want a job. And the notion that somehow higher steel prices because of the 232 tariffs, I haven't seen any evidence that we've lost any work about that, that we've lost any downstream industries about that. I don't believe it at all. I know that people that are against tariffs will always say that. And the other thing you find out about every businessman is they all want tariffs on their products and no tariffs on any of their inputs, right? So that they basically can arbitrage the difference. But if you have a sense of, I would say the President's steel program was a success. And I would say if you have a sensible program of tariffs that's going to get you to balance, that you won't have to worry about downstream industries. Anyway,
Thank you.
Maybe just one more question.
Ambassador Lighthizer.
Or if I have to go one on each side, if that's required, for fairness. I'm all into fairness.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to have you with us. My question is particularly on the World Trade Organization. We all know that
trade?
Sorry? Look, can you hear me better?
I didn't hear the...
Better? Okay. I want to speak about the World Trade Organization. We all know the World Trade Organization has serious flaws, particularly in its dispute settlement mechanism, its inability to create a new free trade round since Doha, and its inability to monitor its members' trade policies. How can the WTO really be reformed? And if it can't be reformed, what should be replaced?
So, I have a long history of criticizing the WTO. It goes back before the WTO even started, when it was still the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So when I get a question like that, I say this. What is the WTO, all right? And I talk to intelligent people who really know it and study it. I say, what is it? And they think, well, it sets tariffs or it sets rules or it does. The WTO, conceptually, is exactly two things. It's a room like this, where you can have trade negotiations, and it's a dispute settlement process. That's all it is. Everything else is just a lot of bureaucrats styling up stuff and packing and talking to each other. The reality is, there have been no serious negotiations since we started the WTO 25 years ago. There's been some minor ones that weren't very significant. It hasn't been around as long as we've gone since the Second World War without a trade round. So it's failing on the negotiating objective. Is it doing some minor negotiations, resolving issues between countries, trade irritants? Sure, I'm sure it's doing that, and that's probably fine. The problem that I have with the WTO is the second, the dispute settlement process. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. I'll be very, very, very brief. The notion of the dispute settlement process is that we could have a serious, important trade problem with, say, I don't know, China, and that a member of the Communist Party of China could sit on a panel and give us an objective answer. Now, that's the assumption of the dispute settlement process. And of course, any sane person would say it's nonsense. It's not quite as clear that you would get a biased answer from other countries, but most of them you do. So the basic premise that there is some arbitrator, some Brandeis out there who's going to actually make a legitimate, honest decision really doesn't stand up, in my opinion. Secondly, the purpose of the dispute settlement was to have one-off decisions about a conflict between two people, right? What they have done instead, as all bureaucracies do, is begin to create its own law. So instead of deciding whether France is right and Mexico's wrong, they're deciding what the obligations of all the members of the WTO should be. They're making jurisprudence. They even cite back and forth to their own opinions. And that was never agreed to. It was explicitly not agreed to by the United States. If you want concessions in the United States, we have a negotiation and you make concessions to us. That's not what's going on. So the concept of the dispute settlement is bad. It is bad in action. It actually has turned out to be bad for the United States. We are all predominantly a defendant. Europe, for example, has sued us much more than they sue China. And when we win cases, essentially nothing happens. And when we lose cases, we foolishly change policy that hurts people. So to me, you keep the negotiating function and you get rid of the dispute settlement, binding dispute settlement. And I would say that has been my policy since the Reagan administration, when the first idea about the Uruguay round bubbled up. And I've been sort of consistent on that. I predicted it's going to be bad for America. And it has turned out to be that way. The dispute settlement, the negotiating, it's good. There's nothing wrong with having people negotiate.
Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe one more question.
Our last question, yep, as requested right here. Over here is our last question.
All right.
Hello, Ambassador.
I can barely see and can't hear. That's a disadvantage when you're up here.
I'm here, I promise.
I see you.
Thank you again for speaking to us today, Ambassador Lighthizer, and I'm sorry you've had to deal with so many free traders.
It's been the bane of my whole life. But on balance, everything turned out okay.
I have a question that's in general about Chinese investment in the United States. There's sort of an ongoing situation right now, and you, and I'm sure these very smart and handsome people in this room might have heard of this. There's a Chinese company, the Fufeng Group, that's trying to build a corn wet milling plant in North Dakota right now. The chairman of the group, Li Xuechun, is a member of the Chinese Communist Party, was part of the Shandong People's Conference, 14th and 15th. The mayor of the town of Grand Forks and the governor of North Dakota both support the construction of the corn wet milling plant, but the senator opposes it, as does as Marco Rubio. I was wondering, just in general, what you think about this situation and what you think about Chinese investment in the United States. Thank you.
So just back to principles, right, which I always do. First of all, can we buy land in China?
No.
No. Can we lease land in China? The answer is no. All right? You need a Chinese intermediary to do that. Another question. Would China let us have access to land 16 miles away from its primary drone proving ground? Probably not. Probably not. So to me, I start one, I don't think the Chinese should own land in the United States. I think all these investments are a mistake, but just breathlessly stupid to let them have access to land where they can literally spy on our drone program. I mean, there are people, I went to a program not long ago, there are people that think the whole future of the military conflict is drones. And we, by the way, import like about 90% of our drones from where? Anybody got a guess? Yeah, Jesus, we've seen these people have learned. So to me, I think it's bad economics. I think it's stupid to sell to China and to have it within 16 miles of a vital U.S. military institution is madness. So I would go against it on balance.
Thank you.
Listen, thank you all very much. I apologize for my rudeness to all my libertarian friends and admirers, and also the libertarians, the other libertarians too. But I do think these are really important issues, and I'm glad you all are thinking about them. And I think the notion of economic nationalism, of worrying about America first, of manufacturing here and growing here, really, really, really is important. We have to figure out a way to maintain trade, have it be balanced, and still have a vibrant, healthy middle class in America. Thank you.